What was a typical day in the life of a Viking? Some movies and books would have us believe that it meant an action-packed day of looting and plundering before celebrating with a raucous feast at a bonfire. The reality, though, was decidedly more peaceful. That's not to say that Vikings didn't carry out plenty of raids and enjoy whining and dining. This they did, and they did it well. But their daily lives were surprisingly structured and centered around an agrarian lifestyle that was extremely labor-intensive. The word Viking comes from an Old Norse word meaning raider or pirate. The name is stuck to describe this Scandinavian group of people as a whole. However, the raiding and seafaring was reserved almost exclusively for the men and weren't a regular part of their lives. Instead, daily life as Vikings revolved around contributing to their family or community as best they could. Whether it was plowing their land, preparing meals, crafting tools, or mashing grain, everyone in the Viking world had a job to do. The Vikings lived a subsistence existence in what is now largely Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. They also formed settlements in other regions such as Iceland, Greenland, England, Scotland, and as far as eastern Canada. For the main, though, most Vikings lived in what we know as Scandinavia. They tended to base themselves in small villages or family settlements near the coast. This served two purposes. First of all, living near the sea meant that they could fish, which was a major part of their diet. Also, the inland of Scandinavia was thick with rugged mountains and forests. This made travel difficult, so it was easier to move from place to place by boat, making shipbuilding an integral part of Viking life. Viking societies were basically divided into three classes. At the top of the three were the jarls, who were wealthy landowners and had a big say in political and economic affairs. The majority of Vikings were known as carls. They were your typical everyday person, free to own land, take part in trading and business, and contribute to the community. Carls were farmers, craftsmen, shipbuilders, and they were the glue of Viking society. They also formed the bulk of personnel when it came to carrying out raids and expeditions. At the bottom of the ladder were thralls. These unfortunates were essentially slaves. Thralls were either born into slavery or had been captured on raids and put to work. The most arduous and taxing job, such as plowing the earth or constructing buildings, was left to the thralls. Regardless of class, these people generally lived in rural communities that varied in size. Some settled by themselves with their families and relatives, while others lived in villages that consisted of several farms. Just as with almost every other civilization of the time, the Viking lives revolved around using their natural resources. The daily work was decided by gender. Men tended to crops and livestock, and women looked after things on the domestic front. Depending on the season, Viking men had all sorts of jobs to keep them busy. Wheat was a staple food in the diet, and fields had to be plowed. This was a tough job, often carried out in the late winter in bracing weather. Whenever possible, Vikings had the slaves perform this work and busy themselves with other tasks. Once fields were ready, wheat was planted and then fields were fertilized with manure. When the wheat was ready for harvesting, it was to be threshed, often by men and boys. Threshing is the process of removing the edible part of the grain from the stalk, and it's a physically tiring task. However, grain was used for all kinds of dishes and was the backbone for most Viking meals. Women used the grain to make flour for bread or porridge, which were eaten several times daily. They also crafted the grain into beer, which was another staple of the Viking diet. The extremely physical lifestyle meant that they weren't overly fussed about counting calories. Other men tended to livestock, either preparing them for slaughter or herding them into the fields for grazing. The Vikings farmed the typical animals, such as sheep, pigs, chickens, and cows, although cows were primarily used for their dairy output. Children were taught their roles from a young age. One of their first jobs was to grind the wheat grains into flour. As they got older, girls began helping the women prepare food, make and mend clothes, and tend to crops as much as they could. As winter approached, fish had to be smoked and salted so that they could be stored away and eaten over the colder months. Boys followed the men onto the fields or into the fishing boats. Additionally, the Vikings are renowned for their widespread raids and battle culture, and any boys who showed promise were trained up and taken on expeditions. Boys as young as 12 were taken on raids, as long as they could prove they could use at least basic weapons such as spears and axes. When the men went on trading expeditions or raids, women and girls were left to look after the livestock and crops. The crops tended to be the staples such as oats, barley, and wheat, with a few vegetables if the climate and soil permitted. The Vikings kept animals for their food production and as a source of clothing. The chilly Scandinavian conditions meant woolen clothes and furs were a must. The mothers and daughters used wooden spindles to make thread from wool, and they fashioned sturdy trousers and shirts for the men and practical dresses for the women. The Viking clothes had to be both durable to withstand the endless physical labor and sufficiently warm enough for the long Scandinavian winters. At the end of a long day of toil, Vikings would retreat to their longhouses, rectangular-shaped homes built from wood, stones, and mud. The center of the longhouse was the place to be. It was the hearth, or fireplace, and that is where the action was. It was where the cooking and eating were done, and where the blazing warmth provided a blissful relief at the end of another productive day. The longhouses were typically accompanied by other buildings, which each served a specific purpose. These included metal and carpentry workshops, storage sheds, and barns for chickens and pigs. Although even the Vikings were reasonably self-sufficient, they still pined for even more goods and creature comforts. Their various expeditions to nearby countries in Europe and the British Isles, the Vikings realized that there were plenty of spoils just waiting to be taken. And they did this with ruthless efficiency. They were tough and skilled warriors, and they came from a culture that used organized violence to preserve the social order. There was no central ruling authority in Viking society, so to maintain order, citizens were left to resolve disputes on their own. This was often done in the form of a duel, known as holmgang. Holmgang were organized duels using weaponry such as swords, axes, and shields. They often went to the death, or until one party was severely injured or surrendered. This ritual was widespread throughout the Viking world, and it only served to make the Viking warriors even more ferocious in battle. Their main targets were initially hit-and-run coastal towns in the British Isles, but they grew more and more daring and began full-scale raids on areas of mainland Europe. They excelled at hand-to-hand combat, as they'd been training since they could walk. Most British and European townsfolk were too intimidated to really put up much resistance, and the raids proved to be highly profitable. The goal of the raids was to grab as much booty as they could. Food, fur, weapons, all of it, jewelry, all was seized to be used or traded later on. Catching slaves was another perk of the raid, and they were soon put to work on Viking farms back in Scandinavia. When the Vikings returned with the spoils, they were distributed as needed throughout the participants' communities. Most they kept, but weapons, furs, jewels, and coins were always useful to trade with on further expeditions. It wasn't all plowing and plundering, though. The Vikings also made time to let their hair down, and there is plenty of evidence to show that they were a well-rounded civilization. Naturally, they were quite partial to physical pursuits such as wrestling, sword fights, and even skiing. But the Vikings also showed a predilection for chess-type board games and gambling. Singing and storytelling were a very strong part of their culture, especially at festivals, which were enjoyed with roasted meats, beer, and mead, a sweet drink made from honey and spices. They remained a pagan and polytheistic culture until the late 10th century, when Christianity gradually became the prominent religion. Extensive contact with their European neighbors to the south gradually paved the way for most Vikings to become Christians. While religion didn't feature in the everyday lives of most Vikings, sacrifices and offerings to their gods were commonly performed during festivals throughout the year. The Vikings have always captured our imagination because of their proud warrior culture, seafaring expertise, and independent way of life. Their influence can be seen in the modern popular culture, from blockbuster movie characters and Game of Thrones to heavy metal music, video games, and Nordic tattoos, and just the occasional random friend that is obsessed with it. Hello, Tyler. So, why are so many people fascinated with the Viking civilization? Perhaps it's their free-spirited love of adventure that many of us are drawn to. In a time when most societies were content to live within the constraints of their borders, the Vikings took to the seas, visiting lands far away and coming home with adventures to tell, before getting back to a simple life on the land, of course.